My name is Jack Harlow, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022, in the depths of the Jedediah Smith Redwoods State Park, California. I was on a solo trip to photograph the towering giants of the forest, a getaway that I thought would clear my head after a rough breakup. But instead, I encountered something that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. I'd parked my RV at one of the more remote sites near the Mill Creek Trail, a spot I chose for its solitude and promise of untouched beauty. I wanted photos no one else had, a unique perspective of the ancient redwoods to showcase at an upcoming gallery exhibition. It was just me, my camera gear, and the forest. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The first day was perfect. After setting up my camp, I spent hours wandering through the forest, marveling at the sheer size of the trees. I snapped photos of sunlight streaming through the canopy, capturing the interplay of shadow and light. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the leaves. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon a hollowed-out redwood tree. Its interior was scorched black, likely from a fire long ago, but it was still alive, its bark vibrant and thick. Inside, I found strange carvings etched into the charred wood, symbols that looked ancient and tribal. I snapped a few photos, figuring they'd add an air of mystery to my portfolio. As I was packing up for the day, a park ranger appeared. She was middle-aged, with a weathered face and an odd, almost nervous energy. "You're camped near Mill Creek?" she asked, her tone sharper than I expected. "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "It's beautiful out there." She nodded, but her expression didn't soften. "Just stay on the trails, and if you see anything unusual, leave it alone. This forest is special." I laughed awkwardly. "I'll keep that in mind." Her warning felt unnecessary. I'd been to countless national parks before and never had an issue, but something in her voice stuck with me as I walked back to my RV. That first night, I lay in my RV, editing the day's photos on my laptop. The generator hummed softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. Around midnight, I started hearing faint whispers outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but it had a cadence, a rhythm, almost like a conversation. I opened the RV door, flashlight in hand, and stepped out into the cool night air. The whispers stopped. The forest was utterly still. Shaking my head, I muttered, "You're imagining things," and climbed back into bed. When I woke the next morning, I found something strange. Small, humanoid footprints in the dirt around the RV. They were tiny, like those of a child, and they circled the vehicle in an erratic pattern. I snapped a photo, figuring it was some kind of wildlife I didn't recognize. The next day didn't go as smoothly. My camera batteries, which I'd charged overnight, drained within minutes of use. My GPS started glitching, and even my RV's generator began sputtering, struggling to stay on. Annoyed but determined, I ventured back into the forest, following a trail I hadn't explored yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Around noon, I decided to return to the hollow tree. The carvings fascinated me, and I wanted to get a few more shots despite my camera issues. As I approached, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive silence. The symbols on the tree seemed to glisten, as though they were wet, though it hadn't rained. That's when I heard the whisper again, clear and close. It was a single word this time, in a language I didn't recognize. My stomach twisted, and I bolted back to the RV, my unease growing by the minute. Night 2. Escalation. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They didn't sound like words anymore, but more like a chant. A low, guttural hum that resonated through the air. The RV began to shake gently, as though something heavy was circling it. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, clutching my flashlight, too terrified to look outside. The next morning, I found more footprints, larger ones this time, mixed with the smaller ones from before. They led toward the hollow tree, then disappeared. I decided I needed answers. I ran into a hiker while exploring the trail that day, an older man with a weathered face and a pack full of gear. Desperate, I told him about the whispers, the footprints, and the carvings. "You shouldn't have gone near that tree," he said gravely. "The locals call it a boundary marker. It's where the spirits guard their land." "Spirits?" I laughed nervously. "You're joking, right?" He shook his head. "This forest is sacred. The carvings mark a line between our world and theirs. You've upset the balance. You need to make it right." "How?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. "Offer something meaningful, something important to you, and leave." That evening, I returned to the hollow tree with trembling hands. I placed my camera gear, my most prized possession, in the hollow as an offering. The air around me felt electric, heavy, as though the forest itself was watching. The whispers stopped. Relieved, I started back toward the RV, but my path was blocked. Shadowy figures with elongated limbs emerged from the trees, their reflective eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Panic surged through me, and I veered off the trail, running blindly through the forest until I stumbled upon an abandoned ranger station. Inside, I found old photographs and notes about previous disappearances in the area. The same symbols I'd seen on the tree were scrawled in the margins of the papers, along with warnings about the guardians. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the station. The shadowy figures appeared outside the windows, pressing against the glass but not breaking through. I realized they weren't going to let me leave unless I did something drastic. I remembered a passage in the notes about purification rituals and fire. Grabbing an old lighter from my pocket, I lit a small fire in a metal trash can, feeding it with papers from the desk. The flames flickered and danced, and the figures seemed to retreat, their outlines dissolving into the shadows. By the time the fire died out, they were gone. I stumbled back to the RV, half expecting it not to start, but the engine roared to life. As I drove out of the park, I felt the weight of the forest lift, though the memory of those eyes stayed with me. I deleted every photo I'd taken in the park. The gallery show was a bust, but I didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling that those spirits were still watching, still guarding their land, and I wasn't about to give them any reason to come after me again. To this day, I don't camp alone, and I'll never go back to Jedediah Smith. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed. My name is Lucas Reed. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2023, during one of the hottest weeks on record in Death Valley, California. I was on a solo trip parked near Racetrack Playa, determined to prove my mettle as a survivalist. I thought I could handle anything nature threw at me. I was wrong. When I pulled my RV into the secluded spot near the Racetrack Playa, I was exhilarated. The air shimmered with heat, and the desolation of the place was exactly what I'd hoped for. No people, no distractions, just me and the endless expanse of desert. I wanted to test my survival skills, take photos, and document my experience for my blog, Wilderness Unplugged. The first thing I did was set up my gear. Solar panels, water filtration system, and a basic perimeter alarm made from string and cans. By late afternoon, I was wandering the playa, marveling at the mysterious sailing stones, that left trails in the cracked earth. They were eerie but fascinating. Rocks that seemed to move on their own, though no one had ever witnessed it. That's when I saw him. A gaunt, weathered man stood about 20 yards away, leaning on a walking stick. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his skin was sunburned to a crisp. He was staring at me, unblinking. When I waved, he didn't wave back but slowly walked toward me. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a raspy voice. "Excuse me?" I asked, taken aback. "This place? It's not for people. Leave before sunset," he muttered, his eyes darting to the horizon. "Why? What's wrong with it?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. He didn't answer, just shook his head and shuffled away. I watched him disappear into the distance, wondering if he was a drifter or just dehydrated. Either way, I decided not to let his cryptic warning ruin my first night. The first night was uneventful, until it wasn't. I was editing photos on my laptop when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails against metal. It came from the back of the RV. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The desert was silent except for the occasional gust of wind. I scanned the area but saw nothing. Relieved, I convinced myself it was just a piece of debris blown against the RV. Back inside, I locked the door and tried to shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. When I woke the next morning, I found tracks in the sand around the RV. They weren't footprints exactly. They were long, thin drag marks, almost like fingers clawing at the earth. My stomach turned, but I told myself it had to be some kind of desert animal. Day 2 started badly. My solar panels barely charged, my GPS was glitching, and my water filtration pump refused to work. I spent hours troubleshooting, cursing under the blazing sun. By noon, I was dehydrated and frustrated. To clear my head, I wandered back to the playa with my camera. The heat was oppressive, and mirages danced on the horizon. As I snapped photos, I started to feel like I was being watched. The sensation was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with every passing minute. Turning around, I saw nothing but endless desert. Yet, the feeling wouldn't go away. When I returned to the RV, I noticed something else. One of my water jugs had been punctured, its contents spilling into the sand. The strange tracks from the night before were back, circling the RV in erratic patterns. I felt a chill despite the heat. That night, I was on edge. I double-checked my makeshift alarm system and kept a flashlight within reach. Around midnight, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the wind, but soon they grew louder. They weren't words exactly, just a low guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, illuminated by the moonlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. It didn't move, just watched. I froze, unable to look away. Then, as if sensing my fear, it began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. I slammed the window shut, my hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, almost like laughter. The RV rocked gently, as though something heavy was circling it. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I was exhausted. I decided to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. The engine groaned and sputtered, refusing to turn over. I felt trapped. Desperate for answers, I decided to explore the area where the stranger had disappeared. That's when I found it. A tattered journal, half buried in the sand. The pages were brittle and filled with frantic, scrawled writing. The entries described a creature the writer called the Hunger, a being that preyed on the lonely and isolated, feeding on their fears and memories until nothing was left. The last entry read, It won't stop. I've tried everything. If you find this, leave while you can." That night, the hunger came closer. It didn't just watch this time. It circled the RV, its long fingers scraping against the windows. The whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. I could feel it inside my head, dredging up memories I hadn't thought about in years. My father yelling at me as a child. The guilt of leaving my stable job, the loneliness I pretended didn't bother me. I tried to fight it, but the memories grew stronger, suffocating me. My hands trembled as I lit a magnesium flare, the one piece of emergency gear I had left. The bright, searing light filled the RV, and for a moment the whispers stopped. The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced my ears and made my vision blur. Through the window I saw it retreating, its glowing eyes dimming as it melted into the darkness. By dawn, the RV finally started. I didn't question it, I just drove, leaving Racetrack Playa and its horrors behind. As I passed the park's entrance sign, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following me. When I got home, I deleted all the photos from my trip. The blog post I eventually wrote was vague, warning readers about the dangers of underestimating the desert. I didn't mention the hunger. Who would believe me? Even now, I can still hear those whispers when the night is too quiet. I'll never know what that thing was or why it chose me, but one thing is certain. I'll never go back to Death Valley. Some places aren't meant for people. My name is Nina Wallace, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last fall when I went to Big Sur, California, to write a story for my travel blog. I've chased plenty of strange and offbeat tales in my time, ghost towns, urban legends, even haunted lighthouses, but nothing prepared me for what I found in those fog-draped woods, or, more accurately, for what found me. I lost something in Big Sur, something I'll never get back. And even now, as I try to tell you this, I feel the words slipping away. I'd parked my RV at a secluded spot I'd read about online. It was an unmarked pull-off, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The view was breathtaking. Waves crashing against jagged rocks below, mist rolling in from the sea. The air smelled like salt and pine, and I felt the kind of peace you only get when you're completely alone. After setting up, I stopped at a roadside diner for coffee and pie. Inside, a group of locals sat at a corner booth, talking in hushed tones. I only caught snippets. The forest doesn't let go, another one gone. But it was enough to prick my curiosity. When the waitress came over, I asked, "What's the story with the forest around here?" Her face darkened. "You don't want to know." I was about to press her when an older woman seated nearby chimed in. "You're asking about the Witch's Walk, aren't you?" "The what?" I asked. She leaned closer, her eyes sharp and serious. "A trail through the woods. It's not on any map, people find it by accident, or maybe it finds them. Either way, they don't come back the same." I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "Sounds like just the kind of thing I write about." She didn't smile back. "Be careful, girl. That path takes more than it gives." The next morning, I set out to find the trail. Locals loved their spooky legends, and I figured this one would make a great post. I hiked through the woods, the dense canopy turning daylight into a dim green haze. After about an hour, I found it. A narrow, overgrown path winding deeper into the forest. There was no marker, no sign, but something about it felt inviting. At first, it was just a beautiful hike. Sunlight filtered through the trees and wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the trail. But the deeper I went, the stranger things became. I noticed a cluster of bones on the ground, small, delicate, arranged in a spiral. A little further on, I saw symbols etched into the bark of a tree, lines and curves that didn't look random. I stopped to take pictures, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and unease. As the day wore on, a thick fog rolled in. It wasn't the usual coastal mist. This was heavy, almost alive, wrapping around the trees and muffling all sound. That's when I heard it. A soft, melodic laugh, like someone humming a lullaby. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, but it sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or my imagination. I reached a clearing just as the fog thickened. In the center was a ring of stones, each one etched with the same strange symbols I'd seen earlier. The air felt heavier here, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure barely visible through the mist. A woman in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her watching me. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you lost?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then she raised an arm and pointed toward the ring of stones. A rational part of me screamed to leave, but curiosity is a powerful thing. I stepped closer, peering at the stones. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. When I looked up again, the woman was gone. I tried to retrace my steps, but no matter which direction I took, the trail looped back to the clearing. My phone's GPS was useless, showing my location as a blank void. Panic set in, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. And then a voice, soft, melodic, and cold. "You wanted a story, didn't you? Write this one in your blood." "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning in circles. The fog seemed to thicken, shapes moving just beyond my vision. I stumbled over something and fell, landing next to a pile of debris. An old compass, a torn notebook, and a cracked camera lens. I picked up the notebook, my hands shaking. The entries were fragmented, scrawled in frantic handwriting. "She won't let me leave. The forest belongs to her. She takes what you love. The price is always blood." The witch appeared again, stepping into the clearing with an unnatural grace. Her face was still hidden, but her hands, they were like gnarled branches, her fingers impossibly long. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She circled me, her movements fluid and predatory. "I want what you value most." I clutched the notebook to my chest. "I don't understand." She leaned closer, and for the first time I saw her face, or what was left of it. Hollow eyes, a mouth that twisted into something between a smile and a snarl. "Your words," she hissed. "Your stories, that's the price." I froze. My writing was everything to me. It was my livelihood, my passion, the one thing that gave my life meaning. But as I looked into her empty eyes, I knew she wasn't bluffing. "I'll do it," I said, my voice breaking. "Take it." She reached out, her fingers brushing my forehead. A searing pain shot through my skull, and the world spun around me. The last thing I heard was her laughter, echoing through the fog. I woke up at the edge of the forest, the clearing and the fog nowhere in sight. My RV was parked where I'd left it, the door still locked. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I sat down to write about it, the words wouldn't come. My thoughts were jumbled, my sentences incoherent. It was like a piece of my mind had been ripped away. Now, months later, I still can't write. My notebooks are filled with half-finished sentences and empty pages. The blog is dead. And every time I try to tell this story, it slips further from my grasp. Somewhere out there in the foggy woods of Big Sur, the witch still has my words, and I think she's waiting for me to come back. My name is Michael Carter, and I was 32 years old when it happened. I never thought a camping trip in Los Padres National Forest would change my life, or nearly end it. It was supposed to be a fun getaway with my girlfriend Lisa, my best friend Kevin, and my younger sister Emily, who had just turned 19. But Pine Hollow, with all its untouched beauty, had something waiting for us. Something I'll never forget. It all started with Kevin. "Come on, Mike," he had said, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet. "This part of the forest is a gold mine. Hardly anyone goes there. Imagine the stories we'll have." Lisa rolled her eyes, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "Yeah, stories about how we got mauled by a bear or something. No thanks." But I had been on board. I wanted to bond with Emily, who was drifting from me ever since she started college. A camping trip seemed like the perfect solution. I just didn't know how wrong I was. We set out on a Friday morning, loading up my old RV with supplies. The road to Pine Hollow was rougher than expected, and by the time we arrived, I could feel the tension brewing in the cramped space. Kevin's excitement was undeterred, though. "This is it," he said, jumping out of the RV. "Pine Hollow, untouched paradise." Emily, quiet as always, followed with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Lisa stood by me, shading her eyes as she looked out at the forest. "Untouched, huh?" she muttered. "Looks like we're the ones about to get touched by poison oak." Despite her cynicism, the forest was beautiful. Towering trees swayed gently in the wind, and the air smelled earthy and clean. It felt like a place frozen in time. The first sign of trouble came that evening. "Kevin," I groaned, inspecting our supplies. "Where's the extra batteries?" "Oh, right, about that," Kevin scratched his head. "I think I left them on the counter at home." Lisa let out a sharp laugh. "Of course you did. Classic Kevin." "We'll be fine," Kevin said with a shrug. "We've got flashlights. What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't answer, but a part of me felt uneasy. As the sun set and we lit a campfire, the unease only grew. Later that night, the crying started. "Do you hear that?" Emily's voice broke the silence, trembling. We all froze. Faint, distant sobbing drifted through the trees. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. High-pitched, sorrowful, and chilling. Lisa shook her head. "It's just an animal, a coyote or something." "Doesn't sound like a coyote," Emily whispered, her face pale in the firelight. "Relax," Kevin said, tossing a stick into the flames. "It's probably the wind." But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was just beyond the firelight. The next morning, I noticed something strange. "Did someone move this?" I asked, holding up my flashlight. It had been hanging on the RV's hook, but now it was lying in the dirt. Kevin looked at it and shrugged. "Maybe it fell." "Fell?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "It was hooked on the RV." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "What about the food bag that was tied up in the tree?" Sure enough, the food bag had been ripped open, its contents scattered on the ground. Claw marks streaked the fabric, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. Things only got worse from there. That afternoon, we explored deeper into the forest, hoping to find a new trail. Kevin led the way, as usual, while Lisa trudged behind him, grumbling. Emily stuck close to me, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. "Mike," she said softly, tugging on my sleeve, "I think we should go back." "Why?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. I I feel like we're being watched." I was about to reassure her when Kevin called out, "Hey, check this out." We found him standing over a set of tracks in the dirt. They were large and clawed, but they didn't belong to any animal I could identify. The strangest part was how they stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. That night, the crying returned. It was louder now, echoing through the trees like a mournful ghost. Emily sat by the fire, her knees pulled to her chest, while Lisa stared into the flames, her jaw clenched. "It's not the wind," Emily whispered. Kevin, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, stood and grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." "Are you insane?" Lisa snapped. "You're not going out there." "I just want to see," Kevin said. "Maybe it's some injured animal." Against my better judgment, I let him go. Kevin didn't come back. We waited for hours, calling his name, but there was no response. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and told the girls to stay put. I didn't have to go far. Just beyond the edge of our camp, I found Kevin. He was lying on the ground, his eyes wide open and his face twisted in a mask of terror. "Kevin!" I shook him, but he didn't move. His body was ice cold. I stumbled back to camp, my heart racing. "He's dead," I said, my voice shaking. Lisa covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emily sat frozen, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The next day we tried to leave, but the forest wouldn't let us. Our trail was blocked by fallen trees that hadn't been there before. When we tried another path, we ended up back where we started. And then the figure appeared. It was a woman, pale and dressed in white, standing just beyond the tree line. Her face was obscured, but her wails were unmistakable. They pierced the air, growing louder and louder, until I thought my head would split open. Lisa screamed, and Emily clung to me sobbing. "What is that?" "La mujer llorona," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Desperate, I remembered the legend. She haunts those who disturb the forest or harbor guilt. Emily tugged on my sleeve, her voice trembling. "Mike, look." She pointed to a series of carvings on a nearby rock, symbols and shapes that seemed ancient. They looked like an offering. "We need to do something," I said. "An offering, something to honor her." We gathered what little we had left: food, a necklace Lisa wore, and a photo of our family Emily had brought along. We placed them on the rock and backed away. For a moment, the forest went silent. Then the wailing stopped. We found our way out that evening, stumbling into the clearing where the RV was parked. None of us spoke as we packed up and drove away. But as we left Pine Hollow, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The pale woman was there, standing at the edge of the road, watching us. Lisa broke the silence with a shaky laugh. "I'm never camping again." Emily leaned against me, her face pale. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel. Even now, I can still hear her wails in my dreams. I don't know if we escaped her or if we're just waiting for her to come back. My name is Ethan Willis. I was 37 years old when I ventured into the Algodones dunes, and I can say with certainty that I left part of myself there. I wasn't looking for trouble, I was looking for solitude, a chance to capture the untamed beauty of the desert for an article I was writing about the lesser-known landscapes of California. The dunes, I thought, would be perfect. Endless, mysterious, and untouched. The locals warned me, of course. "Stay near the marked areas," the park ranger had said, leaning casually against my RV door as I checked in at the station. "The desert can be unpredictable." His words came with a vague smile that didn't reach his eyes. I nodded politely, but inside I dismissed him. I'd been to remote places before. I wasn't one of those city slickers who'd get lost after stepping off a paved trail. I drove deep into the dunes, far past the recommended camping spots. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind that wraps around you like a heavy blanket and lets you feel the weight of your thoughts. Or, in my case, the absence of them. Ever since Catherine, my wife, passed 3 years ago, I'd been chasing that kind of quiet. And for the first few hours, the desert seemed to offer exactly that. The sun set in a blaze of gold and red, and I set up camp beside the RV. The stars came out, more numerous and brilliant than I'd ever seen. I felt small in the best way possible. I thought I'd found peace. I was wrong. It started that first night, faintly at first. I was sitting by the small fire I'd built, sipping coffee, when I heard it. A whisper, so soft I thought it might have been the wind. But it wasn't. The cadence was too human, too deliberate. I stood, scanning the dunes with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. There was nothing but rippling sand. I told myself it was my imagination, brought on by the loneliness, and forced myself to lie down inside the RV. The whisper followed me, though. Even as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I could swear I heard it, threading through my dreams like a ghostly melody. The next morning, I found footprints in the sand. Not mine. They were small, bare, and circled the RV like a predator stalking prey. The rational part of my brain told me they were probably from a curious camper who'd wandered too close. But another part of me, the part that had been raised on ghost stories and campfire tales, felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Still, I had a job to do. I grabbed my camera and hiked deeper into the dunes, following the ridges and valleys of sand. The desert was stunning in the morning light, the shadows casting sharp lines and curves that seemed almost otherworldly. I lost myself in the photography for hours, forgetting about the footprints. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a figure, far off on a distant dune, silhouetted against the horizon. A woman, standing perfectly still, her long hair blowing in the wind. She was too far away to see clearly, but something about her posture was wrong. She wasn't looking at the scenery, she was looking at me. I called out, raising a hand in greeting. She didn't respond. I thought maybe she needed help, so I started toward her, but as soon as I crested the next dune, she was gone. No footprints, no sign she'd ever been there. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They didn't sound like the wind anymore. They sounded like Catherine. "Ethan," the voice called, soft and pleading. "Ethan, come here." I froze in my bunk, my heart pounding. It wasn't possible. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, dehydration, anything but what it sounded like. I refused to go outside, but the voice persisted, circling the RV like the footprints I'd seen that morning. It called my name over and over until I thought I'd lose my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I woke the next morning to find my RV had moved. It wasn't parked where I'd left it. The deep grooves in the sand told me it had been dragged several yards during the night. My belongings inside were disheveled, like someone or something had rummaged through them. I packed up, ready to leave, but the engine wouldn't start. The gas tank, which had been full the day before, was empty. There were no leaks. It made no sense. Stranded and unnerved, I decided to hike to the ranger station for help, but the dunes seemed to have other plans. The figure appeared again that afternoon, standing on a nearby ridge. This time, I could see her more clearly. She looked like Catherine. Same dark hair, same slender frame. My breath caught in my throat as she raised a hand beckoning me. I knew it couldn't be real, but the sight of her brought a lump to my throat. She looked exactly as she had the day we'd said goodbye. "Ethan," she called. Her voice carried on the wind, sweet and familiar. "Ethan, come with me." My feet moved without thinking. I climbed the dune, my heart racing with a mix of fear and longing. But as I got closer, her face began to change. Her eyes were too large, her smile too wide, her skin stretched thin over her bones. The illusion shattered, and I stumbled back, terrified. That night, the whispers returned, joined by a tapping on the RV windows. I didn't look, I couldn't, but I knew the figure was outside, watching, waiting. Her voice seeped through the walls, filling my head with memories of Catherine, of the life we'd shared, of the guilt I carried for not being there when she died. By the fourth day, I was at my breaking point. The whispers never stopped, and the figure appeared every time I stepped outside. My supplies were running low, and the desert heat was unbearable. I knew I couldn't last much longer. I remembered the myths the ranger had mentioned in passing, stories about spirits that haunted the dunes, luring travelers to their deaths. One tale spoke of a sand wraith, a shapeshifter tied to the desert, feeding on grief and loneliness. It all sounded ridiculous at the time, but now I wasn't so sure. Desperate, I scoured the dunes for any sign of a solution. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a rock near the base of a towering dune, ancient symbols I didn't recognize. They looked like an offering, placed there by someone long ago. It gave me an idea. That night, I gathered everything I had left of value: my camera, my wedding ring, a small notebook filled with Catherine's sketches, and placed them on the rock. I knelt before it, speaking aloud to the desert. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said, my voice trembling. "But if this is what you want, take it. Just let me go." The wind picked up, howling around me, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The figure appeared again, standing at the top of the dune, her face twisting and shifting between Catherine's and something monstrous. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the air grew still, heavy, suffocating. Then, silence. When I woke the next morning, the RV started without issue. I drove out of the dunes without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The locals at the ranger station didn't seem surprised when I told them what had happened. They just nodded, as if they'd heard it all before. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when the wind is just right. I don't know if I left the sand wraith behind, or if some part of it followed me. But one thing is certain: the desert doesn't forget, and neither will I. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 29 when I ventured alone into the Trinity Alps wilderness, chasing a story. As a wildlife photographer, I thrived in solitude. I was used to trekking through the wilderness alone, capturing fleeting glimpses of creatures most people never see. But what I encountered in those woods was something I couldn't photograph, couldn't explain, and couldn't forget. It started with a tip from an ornithologist friend. She'd mentioned rumors of a rare bird species spotted deep in the Trinity Alps, one thought to be extinct. I saw it as an opportunity to expand my portfolio and write an accompanying piece about the remote wilderness. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, save for a quick text to my sister. "Heading into the Trinity Alps for a few days. I'll check in when I'm out." I preferred my trips to be quiet and uninterrupted. This one was anything but. I parked my RV at a secluded spot well beyond the marked trails. The ranger at the entrance had given me a skeptical look when I asked for the remotest areas. "Be careful out there," he said. "People get turned around in these woods, and, well, you might hear some stories." "Stories?" I asked, half smiling. He shrugged. "The locals talk about shadowy figures in the trees. They call them the Dark Watchers. Say they've been here forever. Just keep to the trails, and you'll be fine." I thanked him and drove off, dismissing his words as local superstition. Stories like that popped up everywhere, usually to keep people from wandering too far. They wouldn't scare me off. The first day was uneventful. The woods were beautiful, with towering pines and dense undergrowth. I set up camp in a clearing near a small stream and spent the afternoon hiking and photographing birds, though I didn't spot the rare one I was searching for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily silent, but I told myself it was just the natural lull of dusk. That night, as I sat by the campfire editing photos, I noticed something odd. Several of the shots I'd taken earlier were distorted, blurry, with strange shapes in the background. I flipped through them, trying to rationalize it. Maybe my lens had smudged or the light had played tricks. But as I zoomed in on one of the photos, my stomach clenched. In the corner, barely visible, was a shadowy figure perched in the trees. It was humanoid, with unnaturally long limbs and what looked like glowing eyes. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then shut my laptop. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, nothing more. The next morning, I noticed footprints around my RV. They weren't mine. They were large, with a long stride, and they didn't look like any animal I'd seen. I took photos of them, thinking they might add an interesting detail to my story. But as I followed the prints, they stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. Later, while hiking deeper into the woods, I had my first clear sighting. I was crouched in the underbrush, waiting for a bird to land nearby, when I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trees. There it was. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing motionless on a high branch. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me. I raised my camera instinctively, but when I looked through the lens, the figure was gone. My heart pounded as I lowered the camera, scanning the trees. Nothing. It was as if it had melted into the shadows. That night, the atmosphere changed. The woods felt heavier, the air oppressive. As I lay in my bunk, trying to convince myself to sleep, I heard it. A faint creaking, like the sound of branches swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. The creaking grew louder, joined by rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Something was moving around the RV. I stayed frozen, listening. Then came the tapping, soft, deliberate, on the windows. I wanted to look, but fear rooted me in place. The tapping moved from one window to the next, circling the RV. Finally, it stopped, leaving only silence. I didn't sleep that night. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. I tried to focus on my work, hiking deeper into the forest, but the feeling of being watched was constant. I caught glimpses of the figures at the edges of my vision, tall, dark shapes among the trees. Every time I turned to look, they were gone. When I tried to leave, I realized the path I'd taken into the forest was gone. Or maybe I'd just missed a turn. Either way, I kept looping back to the same clearing where I'd camped the night before. The trees felt closer now, pressing in on all sides. That evening, as I searched for another route out, I stumbled upon something I hadn't seen before. An old hunting cabin, half collapsed and overgrown with moss. Desperate for answers, I ventured inside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. The walls were covered in scratches and carvings, some of which looked like symbols. In the corner, I found a tattered journal. Its pages were filled with frantic, barely legible entries about the Watchers. "They are always watching," one entry read. "Don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them. If you do, they'll never let you leave." I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the cabin. I spun around, but there was no one there. I didn't wait to find out what had made the noise. That night was the worst. The watchers were no longer hiding. They surrounded the RV, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, one of them stepped closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. It reached a long, shadowy hand toward the RV, its fingers scraping against the window. My breath hitched as I remembered the journal's warning. Don't acknowledge them. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to ignore the scraping, the pressure, the overwhelming urge to look. I focused on my breathing, on the thought of getting out of the forest alive. When dawn broke, the watchers were gone. The woods were quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Shaking, I started the RV and drove, not caring where I ended up as long as it was away from that place. Somehow, I found my way back to the main road. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the lingering feeling that I was being followed. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles away, I noticed something on my camera. One last photo, taken at some point during the night, though I didn't remember taking it. It was of the watchers, their glowing eyes staring directly at the lens. I deleted the photo without a second thought and drove home. I've tried to move on, to tell myself it was all in my head, but at night when the wind rustles the trees outside my window, I can't help but wonder if they're still watching. My name is Adam Bennett, and I'm 40 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last year during what was supposed to be a simple family hiking trip on the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California. I planned it as a bonding experience for my wife Kelly, our 15-year-old son Liam, and our 10-year-old daughter Emma. Instead, it became a nightmare we barely survived. The trip was my idea. I'd read about the Lost Coast Trail, its remote beaches, towering cliffs, and wild beauty, and thought it would be perfect for our family to unplug and connect with nature. Liam wasn't thrilled. He spent the entire drive to the trailhead buried in his phone, rolling his eyes at my lectures about the importance of the outdoors. Emma, on the other hand, was excited, even if she was a little nervous about camping. "Do you think there are bears here?" she asked as we loaded up our gear. "No bears," I reassured her. "Just the ocean, the mountains, and peace." We started late that first day. The trail was harder than I expected, with steep inclines and loose rocks. About 3 miles in, Emma tripped on a root and twisted her ankle. She insisted she was fine, but her limp slowed us down. By the time we reached our first campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the cliffs. That night, we set up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and I felt a flicker of pride. We'd made it. But as we sat around the fire eating freeze-dried spaghetti, Emma suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Kelly asked. Emma looked toward the woods. "Someone said my name." Liam laughed. "It's probably just the wind." I didn't hear anything, but Kelly looked uneasy. I told Emma it was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling as I crawled into the tent that night. The silence outside felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The next morning, we discovered one of our food bags was missing. "Raccoons," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. The bag hadn't been torn open. It had been neatly sliced, like someone had used a knife. Kelly looked at me with concern. "Are you sure?" "What else could it be?" I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. We packed up and kept moving, but the trail grew harder. The terrain became steeper, and the fog rolled in thick and low, obscuring the coastline. Our map, soaked from a spilled water bottle, was unreadable. Then Liam's flashlight died, leaving us with only 2 working headlamps as we approached our second campsite. That's when we met them. There were 4 of them, huddled around a roaring fire. They were rough-looking hikers, their faces weathered and clothes well-worn. One of them, a wiry man with a sharp, toothy smile, stood up and waved. "Evening," he called. "You folks look like you could use a fire." Kelly hesitated, but I stepped forward. It was getting dark, and we needed to rest. The hikers introduced themselves, Bill, Maggie, Jake, and Karen. They seemed friendly enough, offering us seats around the fire and asking about our trip. But something about them felt off. Bill's smile lingered too long, and Maggie kept glancing at Emma with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "You've got a brave little one there," Maggie said, smiling at Emma. "Not many kids make it out here." Kelly shifted closer to Emma, putting an arm around her. Liam, oblivious, started talking about the trail's history. "Did you know people used to disappear out here? Like, they'd find their campsites, but not the people?" Jake chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Oh, we know. This place has its secrets." For some reason, that laugh sent a chill down my spine. As the night wore on, the hikers' behavior became stranger. Bill kept asking about our plans, where we were headed, how far we were going. Maggie told a story about people who got lost on the trail and were never seen again. At one point, Jake reached for Kelly's hand to examine her wedding ring, commenting on how nice it would be to trade. Kelly pulled her hand away, her face pale. "We should get some sleep," I said, standing up abruptly. "Thanks for the fire." Bill's smile didn't waver. "Anytime, we'll see you around." I didn't like the way he said it. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, but no one was there. Just the sound of waves and the flickering remains of the hiker's fire. The next morning, Kelly was pale and anxious. "Adam, I think we should turn back." "We're fine," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We'll keep moving." As we packed up, I noticed something strange. A single boot print outside our tent, much larger than mine. The trail grew harder as we pushed on, and the fog thickened until it felt like we were walking through a dream. Around midday, Emma spotted something in the woods, a carving on a tree. It was a crude symbol, like a spiral with jagged edges. "What do you think it means?" Liam asked, his voice uneasy. "Probably nothing," I said, though my gut told me otherwise. An hour later, we found more carvings, this time accompanied by what looked like animal bones scattered in a pattern. Kelly grabbed my arm. "Adam, this isn't normal." I didn't argue. We decided to find a place to camp early and reassess in the morning. As we set up camp, we heard voices in the distance. Laughter, faint but unmistakable. It was the hikers. "They're following us," Kelly whispered. I tried to brush it off, but the truth was sinking in. We weren't alone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard Emma whimper. I turned to see her sitting up in the tent, tears streaming down her face. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the fog, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, shrouded in mist. "Go back to sleep," I told her, though my heart was pounding. The next morning, we found them. The hikers' camp was abandoned, but their fire still burned. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, I saw something that made my stomach turn, a human skull. Kelly gasped, pulling Emma close. Liam stared, his face pale. "They're not just hikers," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." But it was too late. Bill and the others emerged from the trees, their smiles unnaturally wide. "Going somewhere?" Bill asked, his voice calm and menacing. They moved toward us, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a stick from the fire and swung it at Jake, who lunged at me. The stick caught his shoulder, and he let out a guttural scream. "Run!" I shouted. Kelly grabbed Emma's hand, and Liam followed as we bolted into the woods. The hikers chased us, their laughter echoing through the fog. We ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. Eventually, we stumbled upon a ranger station. The door was locked, but I broke a window and pushed my family inside. We waited in silence, listening for footsteps. But none came. When the rangers arrived the next morning, they found nothing. No hikers, no fire, no skull. Just the remains of our campsite and the carvings on the trees. We left the Lost Coast Trail that day, vowing never to return. But sometimes late at night I still hear their laughter. My name is Grace Parker, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a travel blogger, and my job often takes me to some pretty unusual places. But nothing has ever come close to what I experienced last October in the Elfin Forest Recreational Reserve, just outside Escondido, California. I went there to write about the local legends. What I found, well, it's taken me months to process, and even now I'm not sure I'll ever be the same. I'd read about Elfin Forest online. It's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in California, with stories of ghostly children, a spectral white lady, and strange, unexplainable occurrences. Perfect fodder for my blog. I arrived in town late in the afternoon and stopped at a small gas station to ask for directions. The man behind the counter didn't look up from his newspaper when I walked in. "You lost?" he muttered. "No, just heading to Elfin Forest. I'm camping there for a couple of nights." That got his attention. He lowered the paper, his gray eyes sharp. "You're camping there alone?" "I do this all the time," I said, smiling to hide my unease. "I write about spooky places for a living." He grunted. "Spooky's one thing. Stupid's another. Don't go wandering off the trails. And if you hear voices, don't answer." Before I could respond, he turned his back and disappeared into the stockroom. The forest was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. Dense trees stretched toward the sky, their leaves forming a green canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight. My RV fit perfectly into a small clearing near the forest's edge. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear my own breathing as I set up camp. I spent the first evening exploring the main trail, snapping photos of the scenery. Everything felt calm, almost serene. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy fog rolled in, muting the colors of the forest. I returned to my RV, locked the door, and settled in for the night. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft giggle, like a child playing a game. I froze, listening intently. The giggle came again, this time closer. My skin prickled. I peeked out the window, but the fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. Then I saw them. Tiny footprints in the dirt, leading away from my RV toward the woods. My heart raced. There was no way children were out here, not this late. Probably just animals, I muttered to myself, trying to sound convincing. But something in my gut told me that wasn't true. I closed the curtains and climbed into bed, forcing myself to ignore the occasional rustling outside. By the time I fell asleep, it was well past midnight. The next morning, I woke to find my RV battery dead. No lights, no heat, no way to charge my phone. I hadn't left anything running overnight, so I couldn't figure out what had drained it. Annoyed but undeterred, I grabbed my gear and headed back into the forest to continue my research. I didn't get far before I noticed something odd. The trails seemed different, like they'd shifted overnight. I'd marked my path with small ribbons tied to branches, but now the ribbons were gone. At first, I thought I might have wandered onto a different trail, but the terrain was the same. Then I heard it again. Laughter, high-pitched and playful. It came from somewhere ahead, deep in the fog. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the forest was silent. I kept walking, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping up my spine. About an hour later, I stumbled upon something strange. A porcelain doll sitting upright in the middle of the trail. Its face was cracked, and one of its glass eyes was missing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Who had left this here? And why? I bent down to examine the doll, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Small, barefoot prints, leading away from the trail and into the trees. I thought about turning back. Every instinct told me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the prints. The deeper I went, the thicker the fog became. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against my skin. I found more dolls along the way, each one more damaged than the last. Their placement felt deliberate, as if they were marking a path. The whispers started soon after. My name, soft and drawn out, as if spoken by the wind. "Grace?" I stopped in my tracks, my chest tight. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the whisper over and over again. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. My feet kept moving as if drawn by an invisible force. Eventually, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone building, overgrown with vines and moss. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent. I hesitated at the doorway, peering inside. The air was icy cold, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. The interior was littered with broken furniture, shattered glass, and torn photographs. I picked up one of the photos and felt my blood run cold. It showed a group of children, their faces pale and unsmiling. Scrawled across the bottom in faded ink were the words, "Elfin Orphanage, 1943. A wave of nausea hit me as the pieces began to fall into place. The stories, the whispers, the footprints. It all made sense now. This was the orphanage where the children had died. As I placed the photo back on the table, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The children, they were barely visible, their forms translucent and flickering like candlelight. They stood in the corners of the room, watching me with wide, glowing eyes. "Please," one of them whispered, stepping forward. Her voice was thin and brittle, like the crackle of dry leaves. "Help us." My throat tightened. "What do you want?" She pointed to an altar at the far end of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs. On it lay a pile of old toys and trinkets, along with a small rusted box. I approached cautiously, feeling the weight of their stares. The box creaked as I opened it. Inside were more photographs and a letter. The letter, written in shaky handwriting, described how the orphanage's caretaker had poisoned the children in a fit of madness, believing she was saving them from the evils of the world. Tears blurred my vision as I read the final line, "May their spirits find peace." I placed the letter and photographs back on the altar, arranging them with the toys. The moment I did, the room filled with a soft, warm light. The children's faces, once filled with sorrow, now looked serene. One by one, They faded away, their whispers turning into a gentle hum. When the last child disappeared, the light dimmed and the room fell silent. I stumbled out of the building, my legs shaking. The fog had lifted, and the forest felt alive again. Somehow, I found my way back to the main trail without getting lost. My RV started without issue, and I drove back to town in a daze. The man at the gas station was waiting when I returned. He didn't say anything, just gave me a knowing nod. I wrote about my experience, but I left out the exact location of the orphanage. Some places are meant to be left alone. Even now, months later, I still hear their laughter in my dreams. But it's no longer the eerie, haunting sound I heard that first night. It's light and joyful, like they finally found peace. My name is Jack Renshaw, and I'm 45 years old. I work as an environmental surveyor, which means I spend a lot of time in the wilderness, alone, with nothing but my thoughts and a pile of equipment. It's a job I usually enjoy, but last month I took an assignment at Mount Diablo State Park in California, and what happened there has changed the way I think about the world and myself. This is what happened. I just finalized my divorce a few weeks before. My ex-wife, Tricia, said I spent more time with maps and soil samples than I did with her. She wasn't wrong, but hearing it didn't make it sting any less. I thought throwing myself into work would help me move on. That's how I ended up volunteering for the Mount Diablo job. 3 days in the park, mapping the terrain and assessing wildlife habitats for a proposed development project. When I arrived, the place felt more desolate than I'd expected. The mountain rose against the sky, dark and jagged, surrounded by dense oak forests. There were no other cars in the parking lot at the trailhead. It was just me, my retrofitted RV, and the wide-open wilderness. I set up camp at a remote site about 5 miles from the main road. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked the trails, made notes about the local flora and fauna, and used my drone to capture aerial footage of the terrain. By sunset, I was back at the RV, eating a cold sandwich and trying not to dwell on the silence. The mountain seemed to swallow sound. No birds, no wind, just stillness. The first strange thing happened that night. I'd stepped outside to stretch my legs before bed when I noticed something in the dirt near my RV. It was a symbol, a circular pattern with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun drawn by a child. At first, I thought I might have made it accidentally, but the edges were too precise. "Local kids messing around," I muttered, though the nearest town was miles away. I kicked dirt over the symbol and went inside. The next morning, I headed back into the forest to retrieve my drone. It had lost signal and crashed somewhere along the ridge. The hike was grueling, the trails steep and winding, but I finally found it tangled in the branches of a tree. As I worked to untangle it, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. She was dressed in black, her hair hanging loose around her face. She didn't say anything, just stood there motionless. A chill ran down my spine. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. When I blinked, she was gone. By the time I got back to my RV, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The wildlife I'd seen the day before was nowhere to be found. Even the insects were silent. I shook it off and tried to focus on my work, but my equipment had other plans. The RV's generator refused to start, and my GPS wouldn't calibrate. Frustrated, I decided to spend the afternoon hiking to another survey site. That's when I saw them. Symbols, dozens of them, carved into trees and etched into the dirt along the trail. Each one was identical to the pattern I'd seen near my RV. I took a picture with my phone, intending to research them later. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon. I returned to camp, exhausted and uneasy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises outside, footsteps, whispers, the rustle of leaves. Once I thought I heard my name, Jack! I bolted upright, heart pounding. The RV's windows were fogged, but I thought I saw a shape move past the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. "Who's out there?" I shouted. The only answer was the stillness of the forest. I climbed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found a dead fox near my campsite. Its fur was singed, patches of it blackened as if it had been burned. I crouched to examine it, my stomach turning. That's when I smelled it. Smoke, faint and acrid, hanging in the air like a warning. Something was wrong with this place. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear and started driving back toward the main road. But after a few miles, I realized something was off. The road I'd taken into the park seemed to lead in a different direction. The GPS was still useless, and the map wasn't helping. No matter which way I turned, the mountain loomed larger, the trees closing in around me. By late afternoon, I was back at the campsite. Somehow, I'd gone in a circle. Frustrated and desperate, I decided to hike to the summit of Mount Diablo, hoping I could get a signal at a higher elevation. The trail to the summit was steep and treacherous, the air growing colder with every step. The smell of smoke followed me, stronger now. I saw flashes of movement in the trees, shadows that vanished when I turned to look. As I reached the summit, the landscape shifted. The trees gave way to a rocky plateau, the ground blackened as if by fire. In the center stood a wooden stake, charred and splintered. My chest tightened as I approached, the air thick with the scent of burning wood. That's when I saw her. The woman from the clearing. She stood near the stake, her dark dress billowing in the wind. Her eyes burned like embers, and her voice was a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my mind racing. "Who are you?" Her expression twisted with rage. "You desecrate this land. You come here, destroy and take." I didn't mean I started, but the words died in my throat as the ground beneath me shifted. Images flooded my mind. Settlers dragging her to this very spot, tying her to the stake, lighting the fire as she screamed. The woman, no, the witch, stepped closer, her shadow stretching toward me. "You are all the same. You take and take." The air around me shimmered, and suddenly I was surrounded by figures. Shadows of settlers, their faces blank and featureless. They circled me, their voices merging with the witches'. "Burn him!" they chanted. "Burn him!" Panic surged through me. I looked around, desperate for something, anything to stop this. That's when I remembered the symbols. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the dirt, recreating the pattern I'd seen. The chanting grew louder, the witch's form flickering like a flame. But as I completed the symbol, a burst of light erupted from the ground. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into ash. The witch let out a piercing scream as the light engulfed her. "This is not over," she hissed, her voice echoing as she disappeared. When the light faded, the summit was silent. The blackened stake was gone and the air felt lighter. I stumbled back to the trail, my legs shaking, and made my way to the RV. This time the road led me out of the park. I quit my job the next day. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and Mount Diablo is one of them. I still see her in my dreams sometimes, her burning eyes a reminder of what I saw and what I barely survived. My name is Carter Mason. I'm 32 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last fall in Lassen Volcanic National Park, California. I know how this sounds. Another crazy story from someone who spent too much time in the wilderness. But it's real. It's as real as the scars on my arms and the whispers I still hear when I'm alone. It started as a weekend trip with my sister Emily, her boyfriend Mark, and a family friend Nina. Emily and I hadn't been close in years, and I thought this was a good chance to reconnect. She was always the practical one, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and a little impatient. Mark was her opposite, cracking jokes to diffuse any tension. Nina, who was a few years older than me, had been our late mother's best friend's daughter. She was quiet and self-reliant, a survivalist in every sense of the word. We trusted her to keep us safe. The plan was to hike to Boiling Springs Lake, a geothermal lake that few people visited due to its remoteness. I'd been there once, years ago, and remembered its otherworldly beauty, the way the steam rose off the water and how the surrounding trees seemed like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. We were looking for peace, but what we found was anything but. We set off early that morning, the crisp autumn air biting at our skin. The ranger at the visitor center had warned us to stick to the main trails. He mentioned some odd stories about the area, people seeing things that weren't there or hearing voices when no one was around. Mark laughed, saying, "Sounds like they need better PR," but Nina looked uneasy. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the trees. I pulled out the map, only to realize that some of the trails weren't marked clearly. "We'll be fine," I said, trying to sound confident. But something in Nina's expression told me she wasn't so sure. Within hours, things started to go wrong. Mark's sleeping bag tore when he caught it on a jagged branch, leaving him cursing under his breath. My compass stopped working, the needle spinning wildly before settling on a fixed point that couldn't possibly be north. "It's probably just busted," I muttered, but even I didn't believe it. Then there were the effigies. We found them hanging from the trees, a dozen crude figures made of twigs and animal bones. They were human-shaped, but distorted, with 2 long limbs and faces scratched into the bark. "Somebody's idea of a joke," Mark said, but Nina shook her head. "No," she whispered, "this is a warning." That night, the wind howled through the forest, carrying a sound like distant chanting. It rose and fell like a heartbeat, and I couldn't tell if it was natural or something else. Mark joked about ghosts, but his laughter sounded forced. Nina barely said a word. I woke before dawn to find footprints around our camp, barefoot, elongated, and deeply pressed into the soil. They circled our tents like a predator sizing up its prey. "Could be a bear," I suggested, but Nina cut me off. "Bears don't walk upright." We reached Boiling Springs Lake the next afternoon. The air was thick with sulfur, the lake bubbling and hissing like it was alive. It was beautiful but oppressive, the kind of place that made you feel like you didn't belong. That's when we saw him, or it. At first, it looked like a man crouched near the lake, wrapped in animal hides. But as it stood, my stomach turned. It was too tall, its limbs too long. Its face shifted. One moment, it was my mother's face, then Emily's, then my own. It smiled, but the expression was wrong, like it didn't understand how to use its mouth. It spoke in my voice, laughing softly. "You shouldn't be here." Nina stepped forward, clutching her hunting knife. "Leave us alone," she said. The thing tilted its head, studying her like a curious child. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. That night, everything unraveled. The chanting returned, louder now, and we saw shapes moving between the trees, shadowy figures that seemed to watch us from the darkness. Mark grew agitated, claiming he saw a young girl beckoning to him. "She's lost," he insisted, but when we looked, there was no one there. Nina finally told us what she thought we were dealing with. "It's a skinwalker," she said, her voice trembling. "A shapeshifter from Navajo legend. They mimic humans to lure them away." Emily rolled her eyes, but I could see the fear in her. "That's just a story," she snapped. "We're dealing with some lunatic in a costume." But deep down, I think we all knew better. The following night it came for us. We had built a fire and were huddled close, too scared to sleep. Suddenly, the creature lunged into the clearing, its true form finally revealed. It was a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal parts, with matted fur, hollow eyes, and clawed hands. It let out a screech that made my ears ring. Mark panicked, throwing a burning log at it. The creature snarled and swiped at him, leaving deep gashes across his chest. Emily screamed, and Nina stepped between us and the monster, brandishing her knife. "Run!" she shouted. We bolted, the forest a blur as we stumbled through the darkness. Behind us, I heard Nina chanting something under her breath, her voice steady despite the chaos. Then the chanting stopped, and so did the creature's footsteps. By dawn, Emily, Mark, and I had made it back to the trailhead. We were exhausted, covered in cuts and bruises, and too terrified to speak. The rangers didn't believe our story, and when they searched for Nina, they found nothing. No sign of her, the creature, or even our campsite. Weeks later, Mark called me in the middle of the night. He said he found an effigy hanging outside his apartment window. I started hearing whispers whenever I was alone. Words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread. I don't know what that thing was or why it let us go. Maybe Nina's sacrifice bought our freedom. Or maybe it's still out there watching, waiting for us to return. What I do know is this: the forest is alive, and it remembers. If you ever find yourself on a lonely trail in Lassen Volcanic National Park, turn back. Some places aren't meant for people. My name is Logan Brooks. I'm 38 years old, and I make my living as a travel writer, documenting remote and beautiful places for magazines. What happened to me last October in Blackwood Canyon near Lake Tahoe changed everything. I've spent the months since trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But the photograph I found yesterday proves otherwise. It started as a routine assignment. I was driving my RV up a poorly maintained road into Blackwood Canyon to spend a week camping and hiking. The area had a reputation for being one of the most secluded spots near Tahoe, perfect for my article on hidden gems of the Sierra Nevada. The plan was to explore the abandoned Fire Lookout Tower and document the trails before winter snowfall made them impassable. I was about halfway up the dirt road when I saw her, a young woman walking barefoot on the shoulder, her jeans torn and a flannel shirt tied around her waist. She glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, as if something was following her. I slowed the RV and rolled down the window. "You okay?" I called out. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide and nervous. "Can you take me to the canyon trailhead?" she asked. Her voice was shaky and her hands were trembling. "Please." I hesitated. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, but something about her seemed off. Still, it didn't feel right to leave her there. "Sure," I said, unlocking the door. "Hop in." She climbed into the passenger seat, glancing out the window as if expecting to see someone, or something, coming down the road after her. "Thanks," she said softly. I introduced myself, but she didn't offer her name until we'd been driving for a few minutes. "Ellie," she said finally. I asked her where she was coming from, but her answers were vague. "Just needed to get away," she mumbled. When I pulled up to the trailhead, she paused, gripping the door handle. "Be careful out here. she said, staring straight ahead. "This place. It's not safe." Before I could ask what she meant, she slipped out and disappeared into the trees. I found a decent spot to park my RV near the fire lookout tower, a rusting structure that loomed over the forest like a forgotten sentinel. The solitude was exactly what I'd hoped for, but as the sun dipped below the trees, an uneasiness settled over me. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard faint footsteps circling the RV. I froze, straining to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone or something was sizing me up. I told myself it was an animal, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, the ground was undisturbed. The next morning, I found symbols carved into several trees around my campsite. They were spirals, runes, and strange angular shapes that seemed too precise to be accidental. I took a few photos, figuring they might make an interesting sidebar for my article, and tried to shake the growing sense that I wasn't alone. Later that day, I ran into a group of college kids camped further up the trail. They were rowdy, blasting music and tossing beer cans into the woods. When I warned them about the strange carvings and the footsteps I'd heard, they laughed it off. "Man, it's just some weirdo trying to scare hikers," one of them said, "or maybe Bigfoot." The others roared with laughter. I didn't push the issue. Instead, I headed back to my RV, hoping to put some distance between us. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. This time, I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight and waiting for them to stop. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The next morning, I found Ellie sitting on the steps of the fire lookout tower. She was disheveled, her hair matted and her clothes streaked with dirt. "I told you this place wasn't safe," she said when she saw me. "What's going on, Ellie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, then sighed. "There's something in these woods," she said. "It's been here long before us. The locals call it the Watcher. It hunts people who disrespect the forest." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or admit she was joking. She didn't. Instead, she pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket and handed it to me. It was filled with dried herbs and small bone-like charms. "Keep this on you," she said. "It might help." That night, the campers' screams tore through the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward their site, Ellie following close behind. When we arrived, the campsite was in shambles. Their tents were shredded, their gear scattered, and blood spattered the ground. But there were no bodies, just silence, broken by the faint sound of branches snapping in the distance. Then we saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a humanoid figure. Its limbs were too long, its body gaunt and unnaturally thin. Its face was featureless, except for a pair of reflective eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It tilted its head, studying us, then opened its mouth. "Help me," it said, in a distorted voice that sounded like one of the campers. The words were wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Ellie grabbed my arm. "Run," she whispered. We ran. We took refuge in the fire lookout tower, barricading the door with the rusted metal chairs and a broken desk. Ellie paced, clutching her pouch of charms and muttering something under her breath. "What is that thing?" I demanded. She hesitated, then said, "It's a predator. It mimics voices to confuse you, lure you away. I've been tracking it for years. My brother." She trailed off, her voice breaking. "It got him." As the night deepened, the creature circled the tower, its footsteps echoing against the metal stairs. It called out to us in my voice, in Ellie's, even in the screams of the campers. Each time its tone grew more distorted, more alien. Ellie finally stopped pacing and turned to me. "We have to fight it," she said. "If we don't, it'll never stop." She arranged the charms and herbs in a circle on the floor, lighting them with a match. The smell was acrid and bitter, filling the small room with smoke. She began chanting softly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The creature screamed, a high, piercing sound that made my ears ring. It threw itself against the door, rattling the entire tower. The chanting seemed to weaken it, but not enough. "Buy me time," Ellie shouted. I grabbed a metal pipe and swung at the creature's hand as it clawed through a crack in the door. It recoiled, then redoubled its efforts, slamming against the barricade with enough force to bend the frame. Just as the door gave way, Ellie's chanting reached a crescendo. The creature let out a final bone-chilling screech before retreating into the forest, its glowing eyes disappearing into the shadows. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We climbed down the tower and sprinted to my RV. As I started the engine, Ellie slumped into the passenger seat, clutching her side where the creature's claws had grazed her. "Drive," she whispered. We reached the ranger station at dawn, but when I tried to report what had happened, they dismissed me. The camper's site was pristine, with no sign of the struggle, and the fire tower showed no damage. Even Ellie's pouch of charms was gone, as if it had never existed. Weeks later, I found a photograph slipped under my RV door. It showed Ellie and me standing in front of the fire tower, taken from a distance. I don't know who took it or how, but I know one thing for sure. The Watcher is still out there, and it's watching me. My name is Hannah Keating. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life as a travel nurse. It's a career I've loved, but it's also one that burned me out. Last fall, after a particularly grueling assignment, I decided to take a solo road trip in my RV to decompress. What happened to me in Modoc National Forest still haunts me, and no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I know it was real. I arrived at Modoc in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the jagged treetops. The forest was beautiful, with thick pines and rugged terrain, but there was a heavy stillness to it, as if the place was holding its breath. I was looking for solitude, and this place seemed perfect. At the entrance, I stopped at the ranger station to check in. The ranger on duty was a man named Liam. He looked about 40, with graying hair and a weathered face. He was polite but distant, his eyes darting toward the woods as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. "Camping near the northern trails?" he asked, glancing at my permit. "Yeah," I said. "I heard the lava beds are beautiful." "They are," he said, handing back my papers. "But stay away from the collapsed lava tube near those trails. And if you hear whistling, ignore it." I frowned. Whistling? Liam hesitated, then leaned in closer. "This forest has its stories. Some things out here don't want to be disturbed." His tone gave me pause, but I nodded, thanked him, and drove on. I chalked his warning up to local superstition. Every remote place has its folklore, right? I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the trailhead and spent the rest of the evening setting up. By the time I cooked dinner and sat down to relax, the forest was completely dark. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost melodic, a high-pitched whistle that rose and fell in an odd rhythm. I froze, listening. It sounded like it was coming from deep in the trees, too far to pinpoint. I told myself it was just a bird or the wind and forced myself to ignore it. The next morning, I decided to explore. The trails were stunning, winding through dense forest and over rocky terrain, but something felt off. My GPS kept glitching, and the trail markers seemed to disappear at random. By midday, I realized I'd been walking in circles. Frustrated, I turned back toward my RV. That's when I found the notebook. It was stuffed under a rock near the edge of the trail, weathered and damp. Inside were pages of disjointed entries written in a shaky hand. Most of it was rambling, mentions of strange whistling, footsteps in the dark, and warnings not to follow the sound. That night, the whistling returned. It was louder now, closer. I sat in my RV, trying to ignore it, but it felt like it was calling to me. Then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the RV. My pulse quickened as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. I couldn't see anything but shadows shifting among the trees. The whistling continued, now accompanied by faint laughter, soft, almost playful. I locked the door and didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But as I drove down the dirt road, I realized I was looping back to the same spot. No matter which direction I took, the road led me back to the campsite. Panicked, I drove back to the ranger station. Liam was there, sitting on the porch, his expression grim. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said before I could speak. I nodded. "What is it?" He sighed, motioning for me to sit. "The locals call it the Phantom Whistler. It's been here for centuries, tied to an old burial ground the miners disturbed decades ago. It lures people into the forest. Those who follow it don't come back." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh to tell me it was a joke. But his face was deadly serious. "Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded. "I did," he said simply, "but most people don't listen." That night, the whistling was deafening. It surrounded the RV, rising and falling in unnatural patterns. I covered my ears, but it seemed to seep into my head, making it impossible to think. Then the RV shook. The walls groaned under the pressure, and I heard faint whispers, my own name spoken in a voice that wasn't quite mine. I grabbed the notebook, desperate for answers, and flipped through the pages. One entry caught my eye. "Burn it. That's the only way to weaken it." The whistling stopped for a moment, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. Then came a new sound, knocking. Slow, deliberate, on the RV's door. I grabbed a lighter and stepped outside, clutching the notebook like a shield. The forest was alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees. The whistling returned, but now it was joined by a chorus of voices, familiar ones. I heard my mother's voice, then my sister's, each calling my name. "Hannah, help me," they pleaded. My knees buckled, tears streaming down my face. I knew it wasn't real, but the sound was so convincing, so desperate. I opened the notebook and set it ablaze. The fire caught quickly, the pages curling and blackening as the flames consumed them. The whistling grew frantic, the voices turning into guttural screams. A shadowy figure emerged from the trees, tall and thin, its face obscured but its glowing eyes fixed on me. As the notebook turned to ash, the figure let out a final ear-splitting screech before dissolving into the darkness. The forest fell silent. At dawn, I drove back to the ranger station, my nerves frayed and my hands trembling. But Liam was gone. The station was locked, and there was no sign he'd ever been there. Weeks later, I found a photograph slipped under my RV door. It showed me standing outside the ranger station, talking to Liam. But the background was wrong. The forest behind us was filled with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I don't know who took the photo or how, but I know one thing for certain. The Phantom Whistler isn't gone, and it's still watching. My name is Sarah Carter, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a middle school teacher from Pasadena, California, and I love hiking. Or at least I thought I did. What happened to me and my husband Tom during one weekend at Devil's Punchbowl Natural Area has forever changed the way I see the wilderness. It's been almost a year since that night, but I still wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by what we saw. It all started as an attempt to fix us. Tom and I had been going through a rough patch. Stress from his job as an architect, my guilt over a miscarriage we never really talked about. I suggested a weekend trip to Devil's Punchbowl, a place I'd read about online. The sandstone formations were supposed to be breathtaking, and I thought the peace and quiet might help us reconnect. Tom wasn't thrilled about it, but he went along. He even borrowed some camping gear from his coworker, though we didn't check it too closely before we left. Big mistake. We arrived on a crisp Saturday morning in November. The air smelled faintly of sagebrush, and the sky was a brilliant blue. The trailhead was nearly empty, just us and an older couple who nodded as they headed out. "This place is incredible," I said, gazing at the jagged cliffs and swirling rock formations. Tom grunted. He was already fiddling with his phone, trying to find a signal. "Can't you just enjoy the view?" I asked. "I am," he replied, though his tone said otherwise. We set out on the main loop trail, Tom carrying the backpack with our gear while I held the map. The path wound through narrow canyons and up ridges that offered stunning views. But as the day wore on, little things started to go wrong. First, the wind picked up unexpectedly, cold and biting despite the sun. It howled through the rocks, creating eerie, high-pitched wails that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, about 2 miles in, Tom slipped on some loose gravel and twisted his ankle. "I'm fine," he insisted, brushing off my concern. But I could tell he was in pain. His limp slowed us down, and by the time we found a spot to set up camp, the sun was already sinking behind the cliffs. That's when we realized our borrowed tent had a broken zipper. The main flap wouldn't close all the way, leaving a gap big enough to let in the cold and whatever else might be out there. "Great," Tom muttered, "just great." "We'll make do," I said, trying to stay positive. I set up the sleeping bags while Tom worked on starting a fire. The flashlight he'd brought was dim, flickering every few seconds. "Cheap batteries," he said, shaking it in frustration. We ate a quiet dinner of sandwiches and trail mix, the fire crackling weakly between us. By then, the wind had died down, leaving an unsettling silence. The kind that feels heavy, like the air itself is watching you. The first strange thing happened as we were cleaning up. I heard what I thought was Tom's voice, faint but clear. "Sarah?" it called, from somewhere behind me. I turned, confused. "What?" What?" Tom asked. "Did you just say my name?" "No." I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart starting to race. "I heard you." Tom shook his head. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. I know I wasn't. Later, as we sat by the fire, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows shifting against the rocks. At first, I thought it was just the flickering light, but then one of the shadows moved against the wind, its shape wrong, too tall, too thin. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" Tom asked, annoyed. I pointed, but the shadow was gone. "You're freaking yourself out," he said. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just tired. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to turn in, though neither of us felt sleepy. Tom's injured ankle throbbed, and I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. As we lay in the half-broken tent, the wind picked up again, rattling the fabric and creating whispers that seemed almost deliberate. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling our campsite. "Tom," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What now?" he groaned. "Listen." We both rose. Straining to hear, the footsteps stopped. Then came a faint laugh, high-pitched and childlike, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Tom!" it called, echoing through the darkness. He bolted upright. "What the hell?" I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it outside. The beam wavered, barely cutting through the night. And then we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the light. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its arms were too long, its face a pale blur, and its eyes were like pits reflecting nothing. Tom grabbed a stick from the fire and waved it, shouting, "Get out of here!" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tilting its head as if studying us. "Sarah," it said in my voice. I felt like I was going to vomit. "We're leaving," I whispered, grabbing the pack. We stumbled through the dark, Tom limping and me clutching the useless flashlight. The path seemed to twist and shift, leading us in circles. The whispers followed us, growing louder, and every so often we'd catch glimpses of figures watching from the shadows, too many to count. "I can't," Tom gasped, his ankle giving out. "We have to keep going," I said, pulling him up. "We have to." Then we saw him. The man from earlier, the one who'd claimed to be a geologist. He was standing in the middle of the trail, his face shadowed, but his voice calm. "You should have listened," he said. "What is this?" I demanded. "What do they want?" "Fear," he replied. "It's what feeds them. Reject the shadows, and they lose their power." With that, he turned and walked into the darkness, leaving us alone. The whispers grew deafening, and the figures closed in. They were no longer content to watch. They reached for us with clawed hands, their faces shifting between familiar and monstrous. "Sarah," one hissed, mimicking Tom's voice. "Don't listen to them," I shouted, grabbing his arm. I fumbled with the flashlight, desperate for anything to drive them back. When I switched it on, the beam flared brighter than it should have, cutting through the shadows like a knife. The creatures shrieked and scattered, retreating into the rocks. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. Our car was the only one there. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the geologist standing on a ridge watching us. His figure faded into the sunlight, leaving me with more questions than answers. Tom and I never spoke about that night again, but it changed us. We're closer now, bound by a shared terror we'll carry for the rest of our lives. And though I've tried to move on, sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I wonder if they'll ever truly let us go. My name is Nina Delgado. I'm 29, and I write travel articles for a living. You know the kind. 10 hidden gems you need to visit this summer. It's not glamorous, but it's enough to keep gas in my RV and me on the road. Last November, I decided to take a solo trip to Joshua Tree National Park to write about remote desert camping. That's when everything went wrong. I wasn't planning to take the forgotten road. I didn't even know it existed until I stopped at this rundown diner near the edge of the Mojave Desert. I was grabbing coffee, jotting down notes about local trails, when an old man slid into the booth across from me. "Writing about the desert?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "Yeah," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Hidden gems of the Mojave." His name was Wayne, and he smelled like sweat and stale beer. He tapped his finger on the table, his eyes scanning my notebook. "You want a hidden gem? Try the road west of here. Locals call it the Forgotten Road, but be warned, it's not on the map, and it's not a place you want to camp." I laughed nervously. "Why not?" Wayne leaned closer, his breath hot and sour. "People don't come back," he said. "Or if they do, they ain't right in the head." I thought he was messing with me, but when I left the diner, his words stuck in my head. "A road no one knows about? perfect for the article. So, against every instinct, I found myself driving west, searching for it. I spotted the turnoff just before sunset. A narrow dirt road snaked through the scrub, vanishing into the horizon. No signs, no tire tracks, just emptiness. My gut told me to turn around, but my pride pushed me forward. I wanted this article to stand out. I wanted to prove to myself and my ex that I could thrive alone. The road was rough. My RV's suspension groaned with every bump. After about 20 minutes, I passed a rusted-out car, its windows shattered, weeds growing through its frame. Then I saw the couple. They were standing in the middle of the road, waving their arms. A man and a woman, early 30s, their clothes dusty and torn. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I called. "Our car broke down," the man said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "We need a ride." The woman, Olivia, looked pale and shaken. Her hands trembled as she clutched a backpack. "Please," she said. "We've been out here all day." I hesitated. Picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere wasn't my style, but leaving them there felt wrong. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. As we drove, they told me their story. They'd been road tripping with friends when their car broke down. Their friends had gone for help 2 nights ago and hadn't returned. "Maybe they got lost," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "They didn't get lost," Mark said, his voice grim. "Something took them." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean, something?" Olivia stared out the window, her face pale. "We heard it last night. Scratching on the tent, growling. When we woke up, the tent was shredded, and there were tracks in the sand." "Coyote?" I offered weakly. Mark shook his head. "Not a coyote. Coyotes don't walk on 2 legs." We found a flat spot to camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. I set up a fire while Mark and Olivia huddled together, whispering. The desert was deathly silent. No wind, no insects. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional shuffle of gravel beneath our feet. Then I saw the tracks. They circled the RV. Shallow, clawed imprints spaced far apart, like something had been leaping. I showed them to Mark. "This is what we saw," he said, his voice shaking. "It's following us." That night, I slept with the flashlight clutched in my hand. Or tried to. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. Tapping on the roof of the RV. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails on metal. My heart pounded as I sat up, my ears straining. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low growl. "Nina," a voice whispered from outside. My own voice. I froze, bile rising in my throat. "Mark?" I hissed. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "It's here." The next morning, Olivia was gone. We found her backpack near a Joshua tree, its contents scattered in the sand. Blood smeared the straps. I wanted to call for help, but my phone had no service, neither did theirs. "We need to leave," Mark said, his eyes wild. "We need to get out of here now." The RV wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but the engine only coughed. The creature's growl echoed in my mind. It was toying with us. That night, Mark and I sat by the fire, the flashlight between us. He told me about the stories he'd heard growing up, legends of a creature that stalked the desert. A chupacabra, but not like the ones you see on TV. This one was bigger, smarter. It hunted humans, luring them in with tricks and illusions before striking. I wanted to believe it was all in our heads. But then I saw it. It was perched on a boulder, watching us. Its body was thin and wiry, its skin mottled and raw. Its eyes glowed red in the firelight. When it moved, it was almost too fast to see, a blur of shadow and claws. Mark screamed and threw a burning stick at it. The creature vanished, but its laughter, a deep, guttural sound, lingered. The next morning, Mark and I worked on the RV. We used duct tape and spare parts to patch the engine enough to get it running. The creature watched from the distance, always just out of reach. As the sun began to set, we piled into the RV and started down the road. The engine sputtered but held. I thought we were safe until the creature slammed into the side of the vehicle. The RV swerved, nearly tipping. Mark grabbed the wheel, shouting, "Keep going!" The creature rammed us again, its claws scraping against the metal. I could see it in the side mirror, its face pressed against the glass, grinning. "Use the camera," Mark shouted. My camera was on the dash. I grabbed it and turned on the flash. When the creature lunged again, I fired the flash in its face. The light startled it, sending it skittering into the darkness. But it wasn't gone. Mark knew what he had to do. "It's me it wants," he said, his voice steady. "I'll lead it away." "No," I cried. "We'll figure something out." "There's no time," he said. "Get to safety." Before I could stop him, he jumped out of the RV, yelling and waving his arms. The creature turned, its red eyes locking onto him. He ran into the desert, the creature close behind. I wanted to go after him, but the RV sputtered to life, and instinct took over. I drove all night, tears streaming down my face, the desert blurring around me. At dawn, I reached a gas station near the highway. The attendant looked at me like I'd seen a ghost, and maybe I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to call the police. They found no trace of Mark or Olivia, but when I checked the RV later, I noticed something I hadn't before: deep claw marks etched into the rear doors. I thought I'd escaped, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I hear tapping on the roof, and I wonder if the desert will ever let me go. My name is Jordan Lasky, and I'm 41 years old. I used to be a firefighter, but I left that life behind after a fire I couldn't forget. I lost someone that day, a friend, a brother in the department. I don't like to talk about it. I thought I could outrun the memories by getting away, disappearing into the wilderness. That's how I ended up in my RV, driving up the coast of California to Lime Kiln State Park. I was looking for peace, solitude, maybe a way to feel human again. Instead, I found something I'll never escape. It was late October, and the park was nearly empty. The drive down Highway 1 had been stunning. Cliffs plunging into the ocean, waves crashing below. When I pulled into the park's entrance, the place felt off. It wasn't just the stillness or the gray skies. There was a weight in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. An old ranger was sitting in a weathered booth. His name tag read Paul, but the name was nearly worn off. His eyes narrowed as I pulled up. "Camping?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Yeah," I said. "Just a couple nights, need to clear my head." He stared at me for a moment too long. "Stick to the marked trails," he said finally, "and don't go near the old campground." "Old campground?" He leaned closer, his face shadowed under his hat. "Closed years ago. Fire burned it down. Nothing but bad memories there now." I nodded, trying to seem nonchalant, but his words stayed with me as I drove into the park. I found a spot near the creek, tucked under the towering redwoods. My RV was a piece of junk, but it was home. I set up a small fire and cooked dinner, the quiet around me almost comforting. Almost. The trouble started that night. I woke up around midnight to a strange sound, like distant laughter. At first, I thought it was just the creek, water babbling over rocks. But as I lay there, holding my breath, the laughter grew louder. It wasn't happy laughter, it was high-pitched, jagged, like nails on glass. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp wood. The laughter stopped. The only thing I could hear was the creak. But when I turned to go back inside, I saw them. Tracks. Small, bare footprints circling the RV. The next morning, I found the fog. It rolled in, thick and fast, turning the forest into a maze of shadows. It carried a strange smell, wood smoke, sharp and acrid. It didn't make sense. Campfires weren't allowed this time of year. I tried to shake it off, focus on hiking, but the marked trails were dull, too safe. Paul's warning gnawed at me, so I let curiosity win. I followed the fog deeper into the woods past the signs that said, "Closed area, no entry." After about half a mile, I found it. The old campground. The fire had left it in ruins. Blackened stumps stood where cabins once were. The ground was uneven, pockmarked with craters and ash. There was a stillness here that felt wrong, like the air had turned solid. And then I saw the swings. 2 rusted swings hung from a charred frame, swaying gently, though there was no wind. I don't know why I stayed. Something about the place felt familiar. Maybe it was the smell of smoke, the way it clung to my skin and clothes. Or maybe it was the guilt, dragging me back to that fire I couldn't forget. As the sun dipped below the trees, the laughter returned. It started faint, barely audible over the creek. Then it grew louder, echoing through the ruins. This time, it wasn't distant. It was here, all around me. I shined my flashlight into the trees, and that's when I saw them. Children. Or what looked like children. Their bodies were shadowy, barely solid, but their eyes glowed like embers. They were running, skipping, chasing each other through the ruins. Their laughter was sharp, almost cruel. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The children stopped. They turned toward me in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto mine. "Come play," one of them whispered. I ran back to the RV, heart hammering. The fog was thicker now, swirling around me like smoke. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally slamming the door shut. But the children weren't done. I heard them outside, their small hands tapping on the windows, their voices whispering my name. "Jordan, come play." I tried to block it out, telling myself it wasn't real, but then the RV shook hard, like something massive had slammed into it. That's when I saw it, the creature. It stood just beyond the headlights, a towering figure of ash and flame. Its eyes were molten, its body a swirling mass of smoke. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its steps leaving scorch marks on the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The guilt I'd been carrying, the fire, my friend's screams, the smell of burning flesh, it all came rushing back. The creature pressed its face against the windshield, its eyes boring into mine. "You let them burn," it said, its voice a low, guttural roar. "No," I whispered, "it wasn't my fault." The creature laughed, a sound like crackling fire. "You carry their screams. You belong to me." The children's voices rose outside, their laughter turning to screams. The RV filled with smoke, thick and choking. I thought I was going to die. But then I remembered something. In the firehouse, they taught us to fight fear with action, to move even when you wanted to freeze. My eyes landed on the emergency kit by the door. Inside was a flare gun. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, and aimed at the creature. Its eyes widened as the flare ignited, a burst of red light piercing the smoke. The creature roared, its body unraveling like burnt paper. The children's screams faded, replaced by silence. By the time the sun rose, the fog was gone. I stumbled out of the forest, my legs weak, my throat raw from smoke. Paul was waiting at the park entrance, his expression unreadable. "You made it," he said simply. I wanted to ask him how he knew, what the hell that thing was, but I was too tired, too broken. I just nodded and kept walking. I don't go into the woods anymore. The fire I carry inside me is enough. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter, and I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back.